Working with a true expert is an experience unlike any other, knowing they have the knowledge, experience, adaptability, and judgment to serve you and those you love is something special. As a trusted guide through the most important times in my clients' lives, I have realized that these experts are all around us and I want to know more. I'm Brandon Ayers, and I've searched near and far for the people I consider to be experts in their field, interest, or hobby. As it turns out, they're just like us. I've invited one of them here today to join me as we take a deep dive into what places them among the true, everyday experts. Welcome to another episode of Everyday Experts with Brandon Ayers. I am Brandon Ayers, and as you can tell, this is what you could probably maybe call the very special episode of Everyday Experts. We're reflecting on who to bring on and what to do with guests. I kind of realized, took a step back, I didn't think I did a really good job of introducing myself on an episode-to-episode basis or on the macro basis. So I thought I'd hit pause here and take an episode and just put myself through the structure that I interview guests on. And I hope it doesn't come across as too self-serving or anything like that, but I suppose I'll let you be the judge and show me some grace in that respect. But I think to be fair to you and spending time listening to these episodes, watching these episodes, to know who you're listening to and why I do what I do. I think some of that comes across at some point throughout the episodes, but let me be blunt about it. That's kind of one of my traits. I'm pretty straightforward. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to be the guest, my own guest. I'm not going to sit here and ask myself questions, but I frankly went through the same little structure sheet that I have guests go through. And so we'll cover a few topics. We'll do the same kind of segments, and we'll see where this thing goes. So, I'm very excited to have myself on as a guest. But like I say, as you know from watching these episodes, I own Legacy and Life Law Firm. We're just 1 year ago, on June 1st, 2022, I opened my own law firm after being an attorney since actually Halloween of 2013 was the day I was sworn in as an attorney in a auditorium in Elgin, Illinois, with a lot of other recent law school graduates. So it's easy to remember the day. So about 10 years now, I've been an attorney, always practicing in the areas of aging, estate planning, real estate, business planning, the kind of stuff that kind of comes naturally off of that. I've never done any kind of litigation or anything of that nature. But what I want to get into in this episode is just give you more of the why I do what I do, and some of my both professional and personal experience that I think differentiates me a little bit, gives me a little bit of a unique approach to serving clients. But first, I want to talk about, the got a second. Come to my own office and knock on a door. And one of the reasons and one of the things I've discovered when working for other people in all sorts of settings, I was a teacher before I went to law school. I worked, even since junior high. My first job was as an umpire for Little League Baseball. I spent a summer clerking at the DMV, at a DMV in Woodstock, Illinois, and odd jobs here and there. But when you're working in like office settings, you always find out, oh, we're a family office, right? We always want you to be family first. And sometimes I've discovered that some employers, when they say that, they mean their family and not yours. And so what I've done and intentionally uphold when I run my office is let people know that we are a family office, that our priority is our families, the people that we love and care about the most, and the business does come second, and the clients come after that, as tough as that is to say as a business owner. But I have a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old and a wife, and the attorneys people often associate with being paid by the hour. But if you wanted to pay me by the hour from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. after daycare is done to when the kids are winding down to go to sleep, my hourly rate for those hours would be through the roof. You couldn't pay me enough to be on meetings and take calls during those times. Those are the special times of the day. So, the things that I value most are the times, little walks after school, the bath time, the bedtime stories. Just last night, I was telling my son I have a friend coming into town. We're going to go to the Museum of Science and Industry. Greg King, who was one of my first guests on this podcast. Him and his wife and his daughter are coming into town, and we're going to go see the submarine at the Museum of Science and Industry. So we watched a couple of videos about submarines. And it was a really exciting, special time to watch those videos with him. And no clients pay me enough hourly to miss that kind of time. So that kind of family time, golden hour, is just is some of my favorite time of the day. The weekends, when it's all that time, it gets tiring, as any parent will understand. That's kind of the juxtaposition of being a parent, is how much you love those things and how utterly exhausting they can be at the same time. But it's certainly special nonetheless. But I want to get into some of these topics, and people come to me and ask about wills and trusts, and why do they need one thing or the other, and what makes one important or not important. What about taxes or long-term care, and I want to touch on that. But before we get into that, I want to touch on really some of the more formative things that I think it's important for you to know about me and making your decision to tune in. And the stories I tell around these things are really personal, but are important for me to share. One story goes back to a fall day in it would have been fall of 2013 actually. So just about the time I was going to be sworn in as an attorney, probably just before, a few weeks before that. I was working out at my parents' house, working out in the yard with my dad, helping them clean some of their woods that they had, set up burn piles, things like that. My dad just kind of stopped me and said, "Hey, I just want to let you know I've been a little short of breath lately, and I have a doctor's appointment set, but if anything happens while we're working out here, that's what's going on. Just want to let you know. I haven't told your mom or anything, but just want to let you know." I said, "Okay," didn't think much about it. We went about our day, and nothing did happen. And a few weeks later, my dad had that doctor's appointment, and it turns out that what was going on is my dad had a form of cancer in his body at that point. And that was kind of my first real adult moment. At that point, I was already in the lawyering world, already had feet in the estate planning world, dealing with aging and death. But as a son, it's a bit different, right? And I remember him talking about how his values were to make sure he could still do things like work out in the yard and get out and do his job, and not just be in a hospital bed or be confined to the couch under a blanket, miserable, when it came to his treatment plans. And I remember being kind of, upset, or angry is not the right word, but questioning, doubtful, saying, you do what you need to do and you get better. That was kind of my approach. At that point, I was probably just about 30, and my dad was just about 72. And we are at very different points in our lives as far as our ability to react to a cancer walking through our body. And I came to understand deeply, just how valuable his perspective was of just the quality of life. And to be honest, so when a family goes through that kind of thing, my mom, I was born in Rochester, Minnesota. My mom worked at the Mayo Clinic. At this time, my parents were in Illinois, and that's where I grew up. So we went back. So they went up to the clinic. They went up to Mayo and got a second opinion. And of course, I get on Google, and just like anybody does, and you search these, big words, and I found actually the Mayo Clinic's publication on the diagnosis. And first thing you're looking for is their timeline, and it was measured in years. There wasn't a cure for his type of cancers, but there was a treatment plan that wasn't very invasive to a lifestyle. But as it turned out for my dad, the actual timeline was measured more in months than it was years. And by March, he passed away. He got an infection, and when he went to the hospital to treat it, they ran a blood test, of course, and his I'll never forget his blood work. My mom could read a chart, of course. She worked in pharmaceutical research. She wasn't a doctor, but she could read a chart, and she pulled the chart and saw that his blood at that point was 92% leukemic, and he was, like I said, 72. So there's nothing at that point that was going to be survivable, and that was kind of the end of the road. And so we had about 10 days. It's what turned out to get family and say our goodbyes. And, you think about from all sorts of perspectives, whether it's estate planning or family relationships or faith or whatever else there's so much work and everything that went into my dad's life. And so many of those things were completely irrelevant at that point. The track he was on, there was no getting off. Nothing we could do, no matter how much, no amount of money. And in fact, when my mom called her dad, that was one of his questions. Was like, hey, is there something we can do? Is there any amount of money that we can put towards something to get this taken care of? Like, no, there wasn't. There wasn't any amount of money that could take care of it. There wasn't any amount of anything. It was just, that's what his path was, and all we could do was there to comfort him. And it really helped me understand, so those 10 days in that hospital, you understand a few things. You understand, one, you get there for your dad. You want to be there. But then, he has this infection running through his body. So, consciousness becomes less and less of a thing for him. So then, I'm there for my mom. I want to support her. And then you're kind of there for yourself, really, is what it kind of boils down to. See, and you keep dialing back your goals. When I rush to the hospital, when my mom calls, say, hey, you kind of got to get up here. You go and say, okay, I'm going to have these last conversations. And then, a few hours into it, you're like, all right, conversations are not what we're having here. Any conversation I've had, I've already had. It's past tense at this point. And then you say, okay, I want more hand squeezes. And eventually those are gone. And then eventually it's another breath. And eventually those are gone too. But the point is, you just really center yourself on really practical things. There's not a lot that you can do except for just focus on what's important to you and your family, your loved ones. And this was March of 2014, almost 10 years ago. And I've talked about this plenty of times in plenty of settings and plenty of public settings. And you can see the emotions that still come out. I didn't think it would be this emotional for me to talk about. I've talked about it plenty of times without getting this emotional. But you just never know. So you learn these things. You learn that grief isn't a straight line. You learn that you have to kind of just do whatever you can feel comfortable doing. Think about those 10 days. And my brother, who lived in Texas at that point, what does he do? We didn't know it was going to be 10 days. It could have been weeks or months at that point. We knew it was the end. Does he fly back or does he stay? And my advice to him, and as well as patting on the back, I think it was good advice, is like, the choice you have to make is a choice you're willing to live with. If you fly back and you're taxiing at O'Hare and then I call you and say he's gone, are you going to regret that? Or if you stay and it's 3 months, are you going to get impatient and regret, maybe losing a job because of how long you had to stay? And it's just the same monotonous thing day after day. So really, you just got to make the choices that are right for you and never judge anybody else's grief. And then also, although I do the estate planning, there's only so much that actually helps in those moments. I had a HIPAA authorization for my dad, so I could call the office and they could fax it right to the nurse's station so that his brothers could call in. And then my mom and I didn't have to, answer the phone and update them, so we didn't have to be bothered that way. So that legal solution helped. Having beneficiaries updated helped in the next few weeks. But it didn't make it a happy time, right? It didn't solve a whole lot of grief and feelings. It made it better than it could have been. But it's not a magic wand by any means. So you really understand in that the limited nature of things that we can control. And that's why in some of my marketing that I do, I say, hey, this is just about controlling the few things that we can control. Because we're all on a certain set of train tracks and we don't know what we're on. And there's, I don't know if my dad could have exercised or dieted his way out of that cancer. Who knows? But for Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, I'm not aware of anything. Our cells are going to divide or not, or something's going to go wrong or not, or something's going to happen that we have no control over or not. And that's kind of the world we live in. And that's the other point, the really harsh point, the hardest point that I learned was that the world doesn't slow down. It doesn't stop. And we all know that intuitively, but I mean it from a very practical standpoint. I'll never forget, it was probably 2 days before my dad passed. I was, we're kind of doing shifts, and I finally was able to run back to my parents' house from the hospital, take a shower and get back. And it was probably 20 minutes each way. And I was going back to the hospital. And for some reason, about a block before this hospital, there's one of those lane endings, where it goes from 3 or 2 lanes to 2 or 1 lane. And so I was in the lane and trying to merge over, and I just kept getting cut off by these cars. I kept thinking, like, man, you're on your way to like lunch at Panera. Like, I'm trying to see my dad before he dies here. Like, can I just get in here? Like the world, they just don't care. They didn't know that, of course, but the world's kind of uncaring. Even, mortgages come due. Credit cards still need to be paid. Even the most caring workplace, you still need to get back to work at some point. It's just the way it is. And in fact, my wife and I just the other day were watching, I think it's on Disney Plus, Ed Sheeran documentary. I'm not a terribly big Ed Sheeran fan, I suppose. I'm not a fan, but I've never really gotten into it. But he had, I guess he lost a good friend of his at a young age, and he was talking about it at a concert. And that's what he talked about was a really hard thing is when the world just kept going on, and he wanted it to just stop for a moment and respect that his friend had died. And that was a big moment for me to listen to. Is that that's one of the hardest parts. And so understanding that, going through that personally, has made me a better attorney, made me better with clients. And then, if you want to get a layer deeper, how guilty do I feel that my dad's death has made me better at my job? There's that. And I'm not going to touch that more than it is. But then you talk about grief and how it works weirdly. That's there. Like, how much do I use my dad dying to market to people in the very end? That's a choice I've made, to tell that story, to get out there, to identify with people. There's certainly people who disagree with that choice, but I've made it, and that's the way I process things, is to find out and share and build the community around it. But anyway, all these things will rattle in my mind for as long as they're able to rattle in my mind, and they're choices I make. And that's all we can do is make choices. Another kind of cryptic lesson is now that I've been through a few things, my mom has also passed away since. I'm not going to go into another story. I've kind of tapped out the emotions. I'm willing to throw it one episode here. But she died more suddenly, in the kind of like one day type of thing. At the beginning of the day, we didn't know she was going to be gone at the end type of thing. And then I've had the opposite with grandparents and other loved ones who've gone through, and certainly with clients, really long bouts with like dementia, where it's just drawn out and cruel. And I've realized that my dad's death, a 10-day timeline where, hey, we know what's going to happen. We can call family and say, hey, get here, say your goodbyes if you want. And then it's done, and he's gone and at peace. That's about the right way. That's about the perfect mix. The pain of not being able to say goodbye is terrible. The pain of having something drawn out is terrible. And so you figure these things out through experience, right? And so I can identify with clients and what they're going through, and with friends as they go through them. One thing that I talked with my mom about in the aftermath was, I lost a parent before she did. I knew more about that than she did. That's something that you don't really expect, right? And then when my mom passed, I had to call her. Her dad was still alive. He was 92. I had to call him and tell him. At a certain age, when you're like me right now, especially when my kids are teenagers and just got their driver's license. You can picture a world, okay, where you get a terrible phone call, where you figure the worst thing that can happen is getting that call. But when you're 92, that call, you probably figure you're past it. You've done it. You've gotten past the goalpost. But again, we don't have control. So you learn how to deal with reality as it comes up. So figuring these things out personally has made me a better professional, has made me, I don't know if the right word's empathy, but understanding that even my experience is completely different than what they're going through, even though it's similar. And just being able to sit there and serve and address the controllable things is so big. So that's the big. I don't even know how long that went on, longer and interior than I had imagined. But that's the introduction to what tools can we use to address things. Wills, trust, so everything we always do. Those are the big questions that come up. And frankly, even just bringing up those words after talking about something so personal seems mundane, seems boring. But it's a question that's out there. And so the big thing is that there is no broad brush. Somebody actually had a phone call with a client today that was a business owner, and they're going through a transition in their business, a big enough transition that I actually had to bring in another attorney that had experience with exactly what they're going through that I don't. So we brought him in to serve him. But they mentioned that that they had heard, that it's a bad idea to do this certain thing with trust. And I said, well, it's hard to paint with that broader brush because there's just so many kinds of trust. So they say, do I need a trust? That's a hard question to answer. Like, you don't need most trusts probably, and maybe you don't need any trusts. In Illinois, if you're concerned about probate and you own a house, then yeah, you need a trust to avoid probate, I'd say. There could be a couple other solutions. I personally think they're not the best solutions, but a trust might be the best way to avoid probate. A will is a good solution for a young family that wants to make sure their kids just get to the right house. If something happens to them on a date night that goes wrong, that could be a good solution. Powers of attorney are good for the emergency while you're alive but need help. You can't make decisions for yourself. All these documents interplay with each other and apply to certain situations. So the mistake that people make with estate planning is assuming that one thing they have applies to all the situations they're going to ever have. The analogy I often make is, just probably a few weeks ago it probably became relevant, is, when you swap out, your snowblower for your lawnmower, right? If you, at the beginning of spring, just kept your snowblower as your tool of choice and started taking that to your grass, and you suppose, the blade at the snowblower would probably cut some of the grass, but it's going to be pretty frustrating and probably pretty ugly if it does the job at all, right? So just like, you're using, at the end of the day, you're using the wrong tool for the wrong job, even if it might make the same sound or get close to looking like the job, at least got attempted. It's the same thing with estate planning tools. If you're using the wrong tool for the wrong job, maybe you get lucky and everything works out. If the sun's shining and everything works, but most likely you're going to be frustrated, exhausted, tired, and the job probably will be left undone. So whether you need a will or a trust, powers of attorney, it's a tough one to answer in generality. The answer is probably yes to at least some of those. But the thing I always caution people with is that, and this is true for all sorts of things in life, is that doing nothing is a decision in itself. People get afraid, especially when we talk about topics like we're talking about here, death and disease and dying and disability. I didn't intentionally make those all D's, but there's something there with the alliteration. All those things are not comfortable things, so people like to avoid them. And when you avoid them, you're making a choice to avoid them. And you're making a choice to, in this example, go by the state of Illinois' default rules for what happens when you're gone. Go by the hospital policies of who they can talk to when you're sick in bed with cancer and you have 10 days to live, and who they can disclose information to. and who they allow in your hospital room. You're left at the whim of those people and governments. And frankly, I don't think it's a political thing, but I think those are personal times. Those are things you want to have control over, and you can with pretty simple documents that have some heavy decisions in them, but with the right guide can get them done in a simple way. So again, wills and trusts, I think they're good tools for the right job, but if you're using them for the wrong job, they're going to be the wrong tools, and you're going to be frustrated with them. And that's where these things get a bad rap. Whether or not you've heard, oh, nobody needs a trust, it's for the wealthy people. That's wrong. Or that, everybody needs a trust. That's wrong too. We all understand we live in a world with more nuance than that, and it's true with estate planning, just as well as it's true with everything else. I do want to touch on a couple things, because, well, frankly, this is kind of where I differentiate my technical skills from other estate planning attorneys. And one of them is when it comes to tax planning. This is something I get really passionate about. Most people, when they think of estate planning, they think of estate tax, which makes sense, given the same word there. But the thing that's coming down the chute that people really need to be concerned about is income tax. Income tax, not because there's a government plan to raise income tax rates. I think politicians generally like to keep their jobs, for better or worse. And I won't get, you can probably tell by my tone which side I think that is, but I'm not going to expand on it. But even without raising income tax rates, when people inherit IRAs from their parents, they're going to be paying income tax on every penny. And no generation in our country has ever faced the amount of inherited IRAs as the people who are inheriting IRAs starting right now. We're at the time where the first generation of workers who have saved their entire working career in vehicles like IRAs and 401ks are passing away. Every generation in our country's history before that has had the responsibility of saving for retirement on the employer through pension plans, things like that. It was only in 1974 that these things started to come to exist. So if you do the math, if you started your workforce in 1974 and you were the first one to adopt, when did you probably retire? Maybe 2004. So if you have maybe a 20-year retirement, which might be the statistical average about these days, what year might you pass away? We're talking about like right now, literally, where we're getting people that have worked their full working careers for the first time, having their entire life savings in vehicles where every penny is going to be taxed. And to make matters worse, the age of the kids, where the kids are when their parents pass away, they're usually in their highest earning years. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, not just for tax planning purposes, I'm on the younger side of people who lose both their parents. Most people are in their 50s or 60s when their second parent passes away, sometimes even older. But if you're in your 50s or 60s when your second parent passes away, and all of a sudden you have to start paying tax on their unused IRA, you're going to be in your highest earning years, and you're going to be paying the highest tax you ever have, regardless of what political football is happening with tax rates. It's whatever tax rate's around, you're going to be paying the highest. It's just going to happen. So that's where people really need to be looking out for themselves, for their kids, for their surviving spouse, looking out to how to lower their income tax bill when it comes to estate planning. Then the second one is long-term care. This is not this very instant like the income tax issue is, but really starting about 20 years ago is where people started to living long enough to really seriously have to deal with things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and all these forms of dementia. And we all know this because for the past 20 years, we've been seeing these places pop up on every corner, all these facilities with the words memory care attached to them. They've been popping up, quicker than any other building practically, because the demand for them is astronomical. So understanding, first of all, that Medicare doesn't pay for your nursing home care is an important first step to protecting your life savings from long-term care. So those are conversations I have with clients on how to protect maybe the value of their home, or what the law protects by default, and what else they might want to do to protect the things that aren't protected by default. And then what's not protected once the first spouse passes. All these things I guide clients through. So that's the nuts and bolts of my estate planning legal practice that I wanted you to know about. And I've covered also, of course, the background of why I do this, because I've seen, for my mom, for example, how income tax is impacted on a surviving spouse who's still working, shifts from a married filing jointly bracket to a single bracket. My mom's tax bill, I remember, went up 13% just because her husband died. That doesn't seem just to me, but that's how the tax system works. So there's things you need to plan for and be aware of so that you can maybe do better. So to wrap up, I want to get to my, the 4 questions I ask all the guests, and I'll go through these quickly. First, my favorite book to recommend to friends is Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything. He's more famous for books like A Walk Through the Woods, but he goes through just really a kind of history of the universe type of thing. But one quote, I think it's even in the introduction, says, a fascinating thing is if you were able to take a tweezers and pull yourself apart like one atom at a time, you'd eventually have a pile of dust that nothing in that pile of dust was ever alive in itself, but it all made you up. So that's kind of like a moment where that's true. Like we're all made out of the same stuff. Like this table and me have a lot in common, but I'm alive and it's not. Anyway, my second question, go-to stand at a farmer's market. I'm a sucker for the fresh pretzel roll, particularly if there's like a good jam to go with it, or like a flavored butter. I love that. If I had to start over and start my own business today and not do anything that I do, I think I would own an ice cream shop. And the reason for it, I asked this question of a boss and mentor of mine years ago now, and he was very successful. And I asked him that, and he thought about it for a second. And I frankly asked it just trying to make small talk with him. We were on a car ride, and he never turned on the radio. It was silent if we didn't talk. So I asked him it, and he paused, and he said, ice cream shop. I asked him why. He said, because nobody's ever angry when they're buying ice cream. And so he's like, I don't think I'd ever have to deal with angry people very often. So I like that. And then finally, at the pearly gates, you can sit for 5 minutes and just observe and watch something. What would you watch? I think you can probably guess where I'd go with this one. I would probably sit and watch maybe a Thanksgiving or a Christmas back in the day, something like that. Just sit and observe and appreciate maybe something I didn't appreciate back when it happened. So that's it for this very special episode of Everyday Experts with me, starring me. It's all about me. But I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you on the next one with another guest who is not me, and we'll be sit back in our usual configuration. But thank you for hanging in there with me this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good one. Be kind to everybody.